Good morning, afternoon, or evening, and Dumela. Thanks for coming back to my recorded videos or recorded audios, recorded lectures. I am Dr. Kamara, and we're getting started with discussing intercultural communication today. And so our line of discussion is going to focus on the history of intercultural communication. So let's get started there. As we start to talk about this idea now, to the right of you, there is a photo of this guy. He has a hat in his hand. He's in the background. You can see kind of this horizon, and there seems to be like he's at this archaeological space, probably somewhere in the Middle East. I'm not quite sure. Well, he could be somewhere in California, but I doubt very seriously he is. His hand is in kind of on his hip, and he has gray hair. Now, this is one of probably one of the most prolific scholars in the field of anthropology. His name is Edward T. Hall, and he's considered an originator of the field of intercultural communication. He really was a leading anthropologist in his field. And so I'm likely to say that the background really is in an archaeological area. He was an anthropologist. He studied culture. And in the 1950s, he actually developed a training program on culture and communication for diplomats going abroad on assignments. So he worked for the United States government, and generally around the year of 1965, he started to write this manual for the U.S. government. And so Hall had an applied approach that focused on the micro level of human interaction. And when we talk about micro, we're talking about interactions that happens between two individuals, right? So that's the basic unit of analysis that's actually used. And what he did is he used that to establish the foundation for the field of intercultural communication. But he also wrote a book called The Silent Language, which focused on nonverbal communication behaviors. It was one of the first books of 3 that he has written, and probably more than that. But the basic idea in his book is that there is an unspoken given that that happens between people. So there's a give and take that happens between people, but it's unspoken. So he called it the silent language. So that's a little bit of the history of intercultural communication, but he's one of the major people whose name that will show up again later on. So here's some things that we will be discussing. We'll define a few terms in intercultural communication. It'll take a few minutes to address some of the following questions. I just kind of want you to think about this in your head. Think about what is communication. Those of you who are not in the field and those of you who are in the field of communication, what is communication? So when you think about that term, how would you define it? Don't look it up. Don't look for a thesaurus. Don't look for a dictionary. Don't go and look it up online, which we should often do anyway, but I'm asking you not to do that. Just think of your own definition and write it down, because I want you to know what your mindset is. I also want you to think about what is culture. Think of what would be an example of culture and write that down. What is race? What does that mean to you? And I'm not talking about running a race. What does race mean? The classification system or the classificatory system that we call race, right? Those boxes that we have to check off. What does that mean to you? What is ethnicity and ethnic identity? And is that the same as race? And how is it different from race? What is nationality, right? And is nationality the same as race and ethnicity? What is class, right? And not the class that you sit in face to face where there are seats. What does it mean by one's socioeconomic status? What does that mean? So take a few minutes to address those questions. And I want you to write them down in your notes. Think about what you think about them, and then how we articulate them in this class to see how closely aligned they are or how different they are from what you were thinking. So let's move forward. So let's start with this idea of communication. So communication, let me give you just a real basic traditional term or the traditional definition. right? The exchange of information. Communication requires that there's an exchange. Something takes place between a person who is receiving and sending a message. So there's an exchange of information or news. That means there's some kind of social contact that takes place between individuals. It can be successful or unsuccessful, of course, but it's usually thought of as a successful sharing of ideas and feelings when there is an exchange of information. So this particular definition is limiting in so many ways, but it's a basic definition of communication. So let's define what culture is, because we'll come back to all of these a little bit later. Culture are shared practices, they are beliefs, they are values by a particular group or a subgroup of people, right? By a particular group or subgroup. So they're shared practices that we have. Then we have race. Race is a group of people sharing the same culture, history, language, and it can also be an ethnic group. We'll talk about the distinctions between that a little bit later as well. Ethnicity. Well, this is a fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. It is the heritage of a group, right? Nationality is the status of belonging to a particular nation or state. Distinctive national or ethnic character, an ethnic group forming a part of one or more political nations. And class is the system of ordering a society in which people are divided into sets based on perceived social or economic status, based on how much money one makes. So those are terms associated with it. Now, if you need to take a break, I want you to do so, right? But I want to move forward, and because we're still in part one, and I can still talk a little bit more. So we're still in part one. We haven't gotten to part two yet. So we're just going to ignore that. So what is culture? We talked about that momentarily for a moment. I want to go into a little bit of detail. So in this course, we are really concerned with the way people live, but there are other ways of looking at culture that you may come in contact with. So let me briefly introduce those to you so that you have a greater understanding of that. So historically, the word culture was closely linked to processes of colonization. What do we mean by colonization, right? It's a settlement, right? It is defined as historically transmitted, right? Something that gets passed along from generation to generation. It is socially constructed, which means that we actually created it. It didn't come down from some space. It wasn't created from some particular space. It was designed for us. It was designed by us. Or it was a belief that we created that pertains to a group of people. So that's what culture is, right? And this comes from a definition of Singer in 1987. So let me properly tell you that. But what is culture really? Culture is in your head, right? That's why we say it's socially constructed. It is your talk. It is your behavior. It is deeply felt, right? It's what we feel. It's what we think. So ways that cultures are studied are studied from different ways. Anthropologists study culture very differently. When anthropologists study culture, they look at it as a site of shared meaning, right? It's a site of shared meaning. So it's something that gets shared, right? The meanings get shared among groups of people. But when we talk about a cultural studies definition, they look at culture as a site of contested meaning, right? It looks at these ideas of power in very particular kinds of ways, right? So culture is an apparatus of power within a larger system of domination. So they look at it that way. It is informed by Marxist theories of class struggles and exploitation. They look at it from that perspective. Culture is a site of contestation where meanings are constantly negotiated. So there isn't just this one meaning. You're negotiating meaning constantly. And then you have globalization definitions, right? That means culture is looked at as a resource, as a tool. So culture is an embodied difference. Apoduri in 1996 suggests that we need to move away from actually thinking of culture as a thing, right? As a substance or as an object that is actually shared in the way that the anthropologists believe culture is. Culture, he says, is conceptualized, it's experienced by people, it's exploited, and it is mobilized as a resource. So culture is utilized as a tool. It addresses, it is a solvent, it solves problems like illiteracy. Culture helps us deal with addiction. It helps us deal with crime. It helps us deal with conflict. So it is a tool that our families and our societies instill in us to get through life, right? It helps us understand the world that is around us. But what is communication, right? In its simplest form, right? I've already told you that this is the exchange of ideas, it's exchange of information, but it's more than that. It's the management of messages for the purpose of creating meaning. We manage messages for the purpose of creating meaning. That comes from Lang in 2009. So, but others will talk about communication as a process. It's a symbolic process where reality is produced, sometimes even reproduced, where it's maintained, where it's repaired, and where it is transformed, right? Also coming from Lang. So it's not necessarily verbal. It can also be nonverbal. It's not necessarily conscious. It can be unconscious. It can be all of these. It doesn't have to be intentional. It can be unintentional. Right? So when communication scholars talk about communication, there are a lot of divergent ideas. You know, lots of us believe that it's intentional, whereas some people say it's really it can be unintentional. I can send a message to someone. Some people believe that communication is everything. Well, Dr. Kamara is not one of those people. I don't believe that communication is everything, because if communication is everything, it is also nothing. Just let me state that. So that's my own perception, and you can say it to anybody that you want. It is also nothing, and they may say, well, yes, that means it's nothing. And if it's nothing, then why do we study it? I don't want to study nothing. So that's communication. So let's go on. The way we communicate, the way we understand another person's communication is a result of our knowledge, what we know, and our past experiences, our frames of reference, right? Where we come from, our positionality, our standpoints in the world. So when we receive a message or see a behavior, we reach into our minds and we attempt to understand, and we give it meaning. I have this written down for a very particular reason, because I want you to follow with me. So it's easy to do it in our own culture. This can be challenging outside of our own culture. And there are lots of chances for misinterpretation. Those misinterpretations are great when we're outside of our own cultures. Let me give you an example of that. Oftentimes we think we know culture based on phenotypic descriptions. And when I say phenotypic descriptions, I'm talking about the way people look, right? That's a phenotype. That comes from biology, right? The way people look. So when I first moved to Houston, I was working for the University of Houston downtown. It was one of my first full-time teaching positions, my first assistant teaching position job. And so I was living on a certain side of town, and I saw this male who looked like, and I wasn't trying to flirt, I just had not seen any of the African Americans in the area, and I thought he looked like an African American. He had the texture of hair like African Americans. He had the skin tone of an African American. And I said, "Hey, brother." And he turned around, he started speaking Spanish. I was like, "Oh, brother from another mother." So I had made an assumption that he was African American based on phenotype. I misinterpreted who he was based on what he looked like. Same instance of a student that I had in a previous class who was Dominican. And he said, "Dr. Kamara," he said, "people think I like chicken because I look black." And of course he had locks in his hair. He was dark skinned. He said, "People think that he said, "I'm Dominican." He said, "I'm not African American." He said, "I like chicken, but I'm Dominican. I like tacos." And he speaks Spanish, I was like, it was so funny to the class. I was like, well, okay, that fits the stereotype as well, right? But he says, I get mistaken for being an African American all the time, although he knows that he has African bloodline and heritage, but he is Dominican. And so the heritage is very, very different. The ethnicity is very, very different, right? So lots of chances for misinterpretations are extremely great. So when we mix communication and culture together, we come up with this idea of what intercultural communication is. Right? The field of communication discusses the relationship between culture and communication. And it's based on these three different definitions of culture. Let me kind of talk you through this point so it becomes very clear to you. Communication is culture and culture is communication. So in our area of intercultural communication, it refers to this interaction between individuals, right? Intercultural is these interactions between individuals. Inter means between in terms of interchange, cross culture. So intercultural, we know what that means now. So in our area of communication, we believe that there is a direct relationship between, let me go back here so that you won't move forward. There is a direct relationship between culture and communication. Where does this come from? Where did the idea come from? Well, you know, the anthropologist that I mentioned earlier, Edward T. Hall, well, in that book that he wrote in the silent language in 1950s, he advanced the notion that culture is communication and communication is culture. And what did he mean by this? Well, he says that culture determines the way that we communicate. Therefore, we learn the culture's language. We learn the rules. We learn our culture's norms. We learn them early in our life. That comes through our childhood conditioning. We'll talk about childhood conditioning a little bit later because that leads to a lot of other things. But our culture, it is our culture that teaches us how to speak. It is our culture that teaches us when it is appropriate to speak. Mom tells us that too, but it's our culture that tells us as well. What to speak about, right? To whom to speak, and other aspects of our oral communication behavior. So we learn to follow the dictates of our culture. The two are interconnected. They're not separate entities. So culture is not separate from communication. It is produced through a dynamic relationship with the other. So the way people communicate reflects the way that they live. Live is a part of that culture. It is their culture, right? So communication practices make it possible for cultural meaning to be created. It makes it possible for cultural meaning to be exchanged. While culture is a system of shared meaning, we've already defined it, right? It makes it possible for communication practices to continue. For example, let me give you this and let me leave you with this. Through the process of communication, people in many Asian cultures, so I'm going to use Asian culture as an example, assign the practice of slurping during a meal. It means the appreciation of the food. Whereas slurping during a meal in the United States is considered to be disrespectful, right? Those cultural meanings makes it possible for people in our culture to communicate with one another. And we also exchange meaning about one another and people from other cultures, right? So this culture and communication is meaning, and the practices are tightly connected. I want you to draw yourself an image to show this. I want you to write the words communication at the top of the page. And I want you to just write the words in the center somewhere, communication. And below that, skip a line or two and write culture. And I want you to draw an arrow up to the word from culture to communication. I want you to draw an arrow down from communication to culture to show that there is an interrelationship between the two. You can do that in circular form, or you can do that up and down form, horizontally, right? Just to show that there's a relationship between both of those and that they are interconnected. So take a break, and we're going to come back and we're going to discuss part 2 of intercultural communication.